The topic of emotional intelligence has received more widespread attention in popular media and psychology in the last few decades. And when you first encounter this term, emotional intelligence, it can be a bit confusing. Your first thought might be, don't we all have emotions? What's the big deal? And this is similar to the reaction that I had whenever I first encountered the term. However, as I started digging into the topic, I realized that there's a difference between having emotions and knowing about those emotions. So a couple of years ago, I began a journey of studying this concept, which has naturally led me to ask, are there ideas here that can make me a better teacher and musician? And I'm happy to report that the results of my findings are that there are many ways that knowing about EI can help us become better music teachers and people. So again, I'm looking forward to sharing some of those ideas with you today in this workshop. As I already mentioned, I've begun studying this idea of emotional intelligence, or EI, as you'll hear me refer to it, for a couple of years now. Once I began to notice the benefits of EI in my own life, I wondered what benefits there might be for my students. Much like my own experience, I observed how my students' emotions had a profound impact on how they learn and perform, as well as their overall enjoyment in music. Studying EI has helped me be more thoughtful in my interactions with students, increasing trust in the student-teacher relationship. I've also been able to use these skills to cultivate positive relationships with my students and their families. And as I said before, knowing how our emotions shape our learning and engagement has made me a better teacher because I understand how emotions are tied to music learning. So here's a brief overview of our workshop today. First, we're going to look at the origins of emotional intelligence as a field of study in order to better understand why a need for this field of study arose in the first place. We'll look at different ways that EI has been defined by scholars and arrive at a clear definition of EI that we can work with for the rest of our time together today. For the second portion of our workshop, we'll turn to music education and the field of social emotional learning, or SEL, to see how teachers have already started applying many of the concepts of EI in the classroom. I'll walk us through several studies that connect music education to several principles of emotional intelligence. And this will give us a clear picture of how music is connected to our emotions and how it can provide a pathway to increased EI. For the third portion of our presentation, I'll introduce several activities that you apologize for that. In the fourth section of our workshop, in the third section, I'll introduce several activities that you can use Oh, looks like we're having some technological difficulties here. Okay, very good. In the third section of the presentation, I'll introduce several activities that you can use in your studio to help deal directly with emotions in a healthy and beneficial way. And then in the fourth section of our workshop today, I'll break down some difficult emotions that we often encounter when teaching music, things like anger, frustration, disappointment, anxiety, and sadness. We'll look at how psychologists define these emotional experiences and discuss some strategies for dealing with them in the studio. And then the final portion of our workshop, we'll look at some resources that have been helpful for me as I've gotten to know this concept, and some that might take you further on this journey. So let's begin our discussion of emotional intelligence by first defining what it is. Before we get into the clinical definitions, I think it's important for us to understand how this concept of EI came into existence. According to Daniel Goleman, who's a scholar in the field of emotional intelligence, scientists and psychologists throughout the 20th century were heavily influenced by the work of behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, who you see here. You may remember Skinner as the inventor of the Skinner boxes, where lab rats were trained to respond to negative and positive stimuli like food or an electric shock. Skinner and his team would observe these behaviors of these rats and draw conclusions about behavior and psychology from these statistics. Now, this concern for measurable outcomes was echoed by Skinner and his contemporaries, and it had a profound influence on many other psychologists throughout the mid-20th century. Now, because emotions and many other aspects of our inner world could not be observed and recorded with scientific accuracy, they were considered to be rather taboo for science at the time. And again, because of this emphasis on measurable and observable data, the main test for measuring one's aptitude was the IQ test, or intelligence quotient test. Indeed, for much of the 20th century, psychologists and social scientists were constantly trying to understand IQ and to what degree one's IQ was a predictor of academic, professional, or personal success.